Okay, now we're going to talk about viruses. So viruses officially are not alive because they're not made of cells, but they are included in a discussion of biology because they affect living things, because they have to use living things in order to reproduce. Again, they're not made of cells, they don't have a metabolism, and they have to rely on other things to reproduce. So officially they're not alive. The list of diseases caused by viruses is extensive, and this is just a partial list. Again, we looked at this the other day when we were talking about our pathogens project. So they're not made of cells, they're not alive. What are they made of? Viruses at their most basic consist of sort of a protein covering or protein coat, what is called the capsid, and some nucleic acid on the inside, either RNA or DNA. They come in various shapes and sizes. Some are extremely simple, like these guys on the left. Others are a bit more complex. Their capsid is rather complex. And others that we'll talk about, basically the virus inside is surrounded by a membrane-like structure, but it's not really a cell. We'll talk about those in a moment. Influenza is an example of one of those membrane viruses. Some of them are what are known as retroviruses. Retroviruses have RNA as their nucleic acid, and we'll talk about HIV later, which is an example of one of these, and how they're known as retroviruses because they have the ability in a host that they've taken over to have their RNA used to make DNA, essentially reverse transcription, which is a unique thing. We'll talk about that a little more later. There are also some known as bacteriophages. Bacteriophages are viruses that infect bacteria, and again they have this sort of really complex capsid structure. It looks like a spaceship almost. DNA on the inside. Again, they really look like spaceships, and here's a bunch infecting this hapless bacterial cell. When these bacteriophages infect a bacterium, they do it through two different ways, what's called the lytic or lysogenic cycles. Let's talk about those for a minute. In the lytic cycle, here you've got this bacterium, the virus, or phage, as it's sometimes called, attaches. It inserts its DNA into the host. Essentially that DNA, that viral DNA, allows it to take the virus to take over the host cell. The host's DNA is broken apart, and what happens is that host cell is turned into a virus-making machine. That is, it makes viral DNA, and it makes the capsid, the protein covering that the DNA will be put into. And so you can see here, after these parts are made, the viruses or phages are assembled inside the virus, and then inside the bacterium, and then the bacterium breaks apart or lyses. Lysis is the splitting of something, and then those viruses are released, and the cell is severely damaged or destroyed in that case. Now the lysogenic cycle is a little different in that the virus takes over or attaches, inserts its DNA, but instead of immediately taking over the host cell and assembling more viruses, what happens is that viral DNA is incorporated into the host, and it becomes part of the host DNA, and at that point it's known as a prophage. Now that bacterium can just go on and reproduce, and what happens is that virus DNA is reproduced in each time, and that prophage spreads from one cell to more and more and more. Later on, what can happen is that cell can then go back into the lytic cycle, such that now the bacterium becomes a virus-making machine. We make lots of viruses, it breaks open, and they're released. So the lysogenic cycle inevitably leads into the lytic cycle. Sometimes the lysogenic cycle doesn't even happen, but sometimes it does. It's sort of a dormant stage. The virus is just remaining dormant inside these bacterial cells. All right, here's some examples, things you've heard of: chickenpox and shingles, which are essentially the same virus, but you first get chickenpox, and then later you can get shingles. It's a type of herpes virus. You get resistance to the chickenpox usually, but not the shingles. The shingles can come back to hit you, and what happens is this is a virus that essentially is incorporated into some of your DNA and certain of your cells. And when that happens in us, we call it a provirus, not a prophage, because a phage is simply a virus that infects bacteria, but there are viruses that can have their DNA inserted in us. And so what happens is after you've been exposed to chicken pox, you will have this provirus inside of you, and later on it can sort of wake up, if you will, and you get what's called shingles. Here's a poor little guy with some chicken pox. Viral hepatitis, this is a pretty nasty thing. You can get it from contaminated food, sexual contact, infected blood. Again, it causes problems with the liver, and in bad cases, liver failure, which is not a good thing because that can kill you. AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, is what's caused from HIV. The virus is called the human immunodeficiency virus, and when you have the virus inside you, you can get sick and have what's called AIDS. And the insidious thing about HIV is that it attacks your immune system, particularly these white blood cells. And so when those cells are damaged and destroyed, it compromises your immune system, thus acquired immune deficiency syndrome. And so what happens is other kinds of pathogens can then attack you that you would normally fight off. And this is spread through contact with bodily fluids. HIV is a type of retrovirus. That is, it's a virus that has RNA. It's also an envelope virus. And what happens is the RNA, through reverse transcription, is converted into DNA. That DNA is then incorporated into the DNA of infected cells, some of these white blood cells. It can hang out there for a while in a relatively dormant stage, and so someone can have been exposed to HIV and not know they have it. They're not sick, but then later on what can happen is the provirus wakes up, you make RNA and then protein, and so you start assembling viruses, and that's when these cells become damaged or destroyed, and you start to have the symptoms of the disease. Unfortunately, HIV is a virus that mutates a lot, and so developing treatments for it, basically vaccines and other medications, has been difficult. Things like polio, vaccines have been very effective against, because polio apparently does not mutate very much, and so you develop a vaccine and it works for a long time. But with HIV, that's not the case. There are also certain types of viruses that can cause cancers, cervical cancer, HPV. You've probably heard of this. Some of you may have gotten the HPV shots. Hepatitis, leukemia, lymphomas, these can all be caused by certain types of viruses. What can happen is these viruses can insert genes into you, those proviruses, and those viral genes can become what are known as oncogenes. They're genes that promote cancers. And when they get inside of you and they become activated, that's when there's problems. Probably heard also of avian or bird flu. This is a virus that can be spread from birds to people. And in some cases it can be quite pathogenic in people, quite deadly. They originate out of Southeast Asia, where they have a lot of birds in close contact with people. Now, how do you battle viruses? Well, antibiotics don't really work against them, because antibiotics generally just work against living things and not viruses. Again, viruses aren't alive, but you can be immunized, and when you're immunized, you're being exposed to a form of that virus before you're exposed to the real one. And so what you're doing is building up immunity, building up antibodies to the virus, so that when you're exposed to the pathogenic form, you can hopefully fight it off real quick. Immunizations come in two forms. There's what's called inactive or live. The inactive is basically parts of the virus that you're exposed to, and then you build up antibodies to them. In live, you're exposed to a live form of the virus, but one that has been, we say, attenuated. It's it's not as viral, it's not as pathogenic, so it might give you a mild form of the flu or something, but not the full-blown thing. And again, you build up the immunity to that virus. And indeed, you have to get a shot when you get these immunizations. But they do now have the flu shot that you can have as a nasal mist as well. There are certain drugs now. So you get immunized before you're exposed to the pathogen, because after you're exposed to the virus, the immunization doesn't really work so well, or it's too late, you might say. But there are certain drugs you can take after an exposure, which can, for certain viruses, can fight off that virus. Tamiflu is an example of one that can be used if you're exposed to the influenza. A couple other things. Viroids. Viroids are infectious nucleic acids. They're not even surrounded by a protein coat. They're just pieces of free nucleic acid that can infect, in this case, plants. They only infect plants and can cause certain diseases. And this is a rather silly one. It's called potato spindle viroid. It just simply makes the potatoes have this funny shape, and there's nothing wrong with the potatoes. You can still eat them. You may see them in the store. There's no problem with them. But now, more insidious, in particular with animals, are these things called prions. And prions are defective proteins that basically cluster in your nervous system, in your brain, and they cause damage. And they can cause enough damage such that your nervous system is compromised, and they can eventually kill you. They cause what are called brain-wasting diseases, like mad cow disease in cows, scrapie in sheep, and in people it's called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. And it's, again, these prions, these defective proteins get in your brain, and they damage nerve tissue and the proteins in your brain. And yeah, it's a pretty bad thing. There were outbreaks of these diseases in Europe in the 80s because they were feeding cattle a type of feed that had cow parts in it. Now, cows, of course, are herbivores, and they only eat plants, but they were feeding them these supplements that were basically the ground-up waste of other cows from slaughterhouses. And so these prions were being transferred from cows that had been slaughtered to living cows. And people who ate some of this infected meat from these cows, the prions were transferred to them. Now it is no longer legal to feed cows ground up cow parts, and so this problem has been mostly solved in our food supply. Okay, that's it for viruses. Thanks.